And years had passed since the great cataclysm reduced entire continents to dust. In its wake, ragged survivors banded together in pockets of civilization, scattering across the endless desert of scorched earth and bombed-out ruins. Towering dunes of parched soil and twisted wreckage now defined the landscape. In the distance, skeletal remains of smashed war machines jutted from the ground like the bones of giant, long-extinct beasts. By day, the sun glared with oppressive heat, and at night, bitter cold gnawed through makeshift shelters. No one remembered precisely who started the cataclysmic conflict that killed so many. The scars of that war had melted every notion of blame into a single, persistent grief. People had forgotten politics, boundaries, and the names of capitals. All that mattered were survival and the fragile hope that somewhere beyond the horizon lay another community of lost souls, one with enough resources and compassion to trade or help. In this barren world, only a few city-states persisted, each carved in the rubble and connected by a web of dilapidated rails. Where once bullet trains sped by in comfort, cargo engines now churned across the battered terrain at a snail's pace, carrying precious goods, water, medicine, seeds, the remnants of technology. The rails that remained had been patched together using scrap metal, leftover airplane fuselages, and melted down war debris. Much of the time, the trains themselves operated on salvaged parts. If a single gear or coupler failed in the middle of a run, there was no quick fix. The desert was wide, empty, and unforgiving, and every journey was fraught with risk. But despite the enormous hazards, these trundling cargo trains kept humanity's last city-states breathing, promising a thin thread of unity where only isolation had once reigned. Part of the engineer corps charged with manning these metal behemoths was Amani, a young woman barely out of her 20s. She had been raised in a half-buried bunker in the remnants of the old metropolis known as Bastion, now simply the Bastion Outpost. Having lost her parents in a border skirmish over a drying reservoir, Amani had been thrust into adulthood far too soon. She grew up reading sun-bleached technical manuals on locomotives, learning from the older veterans who found a semblance of purpose repairing the battered trains, because the locomotive offered the only real chance for survival and perhaps eventual prosperity. Amani clung to her role with a determination that also masked her personal ache. She found solace in the hiss of steam, the steady purr of engines, and the simple honesty of machinery struggling to carry on. The locomotive she piloted bore the name Desert Wing, scrawled in faded letters across its rusted side. It was a patchwork of old steel plates and newly riveted scraps. Its innards were welded from the remains of other trains, battered tanks, and the odd piece of an ancient submarine hull. Water was too precious to power old-style steam engines, so the Desert Wing ran on a hybrid biodiesel gleaned from leftover rancid oils and experimental biocompounds grown in the city-state's hothouse labs. Every coup of sabotage, every mechanical hiccup could spell the difference between forging a steady supply line and losing an entire outpost to disease or drought. The next run took Amani from the Bastion Outpost on a loop that would circle through 3 other city-states: Seraph's Valley, Glass Ridge, and the newly discovered settlement of Chrome Falls, rumored to be flush with salvageable pre-war machinery. On this trip, the Desert Wing carried casks filled with water, crates of antibiotics, seeds for desert-hardy crops, and a small team of ambassadors hoping to negotiate mutual defense treaties. The train also transported a handful of stowaways in the passenger car, desperate individuals who had bartered everything they owned for a chance to reach safer ground. Amani felt the familiar tension thrumming through her as she guided the locomotive out of Bastion's battered station. She could see in each person's face a reflection of her own weariness. But more than that, she saw a shared conviction. No matter how harsh the desert was, they had to keep going. The first stretch of track wound through a canyon of blackened, crater-pocked land that had once been farmland. War had shredded the topsoil, leaving behind charred stubble and radioactive hotspots. Old mines were rumored to lurk in the ground. As the train groaned forward, Amani's co-pilot, a veteran named Roderick, scanned the horizon with binoculars. His job was twofold: watch for warped sections of track and keep an eye out for raiders. Armed mercenaries and scavengers had roamed these lands since the bombs fell, picking clean the husks of old war vehicles and ambushing unsuspecting travelers. Roderick had survived multiple firefights in his day, sporting a jagged scar on his left arm and a half-missing ear as testaments to roads best not traveled without caution. Amani respected him deeply, even if his cynicism sometimes grated on her more hopeful nature. Wind whipped fine sand through the cracks of the locomotive's vents, stinging their cheeks and threatening to clog the machinery. Amani had grown skilled at listening to the stuttering hum of the engine, noting subtle fluctuations that might herald trouble. She found herself anxiously tapping her boot on the floor. The radio beside her crackled with static as a voice from the second car, where armed guards kept watch, reported all clear. For now, the desert lay still. It was a deceptive calm, Amani knew. She could almost sense the unspoken hostility in the air. The land had no pity left, neither did those who prowled it, searching for the next patch of resources to loot. Around mid-afternoon, as the sun climbed overhead in a shimmering wave of heat, the train clanked over a steep rise. That was when they spotted the battlefield. Smoking wreckage still dotted the ground, and twisted steel beams rose in lumps of slag to the east. This place had been the site of a recent skirmish. How recent, no one could say. Measurements of time held little importance in the wasteland's savage reality, except to mark how long a city-state could hold out before succumbing. Gutted vehicles lay scattered along the ridges, their black shells a testament to unstoppable artillery. Emmanuel let out a ragged breath. She hoped they would not find any roving militia picking through the dead. Suddenly, Roderick jabbed a finger toward the east side of the tracks. Through the haze of rising dust, Amani glimpsed a small group huddled around a metallic shape. They wore ragged cloaks, leaning upon battered rifles. The guards behind them had bandoliers slung across scrawny chests. They must have been survivors trying to salvage anything of worth. Or they could be raiders, feigning desperation to lure travelers close. Amani's hand gripped the throttle as she debated slowing the train. Desert Wing could not spare the fuel for a long idle, but part of her conscience gnawed at the thought of leaving them if they truly needed help. Yet, she remembered too many cautionary tales. Fellow train engineers shot and stripped for salvage after showing mercy to strangers. "It's a trap," Roderick muttered. "We don't stop." Uncertain and heavy-hearted, Amani nodded. Survival demanded ruthless decisions. She pressed forward, wincing as the locomotive puffed exhaust into the hazy air. The robed figures watched them pass, making no move to raise their weapons or wave for assistance. They simply stared with vacant eyes. The train thundered by, leaving them behind. In the aftermath, Amani wondered if she had made the right choice, or merely added to the bitterness of a dying world. They rumbled through the rest of that wasteland unchallenged, and continued until sundown, when the track turned sharply north toward Seraph's Valley. Here the desert dunes parted around a narrow gorge, whose rocky walls provided some respite from the storms. A field of twisted, half-rusted army vehicles choked the gorge's entrance, a leftover blockade from the old war. Massive shell craters dotted the canyon floor, partially filled by drifting sand. Beyond that canyon lay Seraph's Valley, a precariously perched fortress of adobe huts and metal plating. Over the years, Seraph's citizens had carved their community into the side of an eroded cliff, building tier upon tier of dwellings connected by switchback ramps. At the base of the cliff, near the valley's only well, a small depot once served trains in a golden age, allowing easy loading of water barrels. Now that well was nearly dry, and the city survived primarily on shipments from nearby outposts. As soon as Desert Wing pulled into the station, its horn echoing off the canyon walls, the local workers scurried forward with cargo nets. Their eyes gleamed with the hunger for fresh supplies, and Amani felt no small measure of relief at the knowledge that what they brought would stave off suffering in Seraph's Valley. She oversaw the unloading of water casks and medicinal kits, while ambassadors from the train made their way up the ramps to meet the Valley Council. The stowaways from Bastion also disembarked, uncertain but hopeful. Amadi watched them vanish into the bustle. She lingered to speak with an elderly station manager named Dana, who coughed whenever she talked. Dana explained that the city was on the verge of fracturing. A rogue militia, veterans from the war who believed in resurrecting the old governments, had been agitating the local populace. They claimed that a strong, centralized authority was needed to reclaim the lands and restore Seraph's dominion. Some of the valley's citizens yearned for a return to imagined glory. Others just wanted peace. The tension was palpable. Even as the final crates left the cargo cars, Amani felt the weight of hostility pressing in. Seraph might become another war zone if the militia decided to strike, but if the city fell completely, the desert would sink further into chaos. Amani reassured Dana that Bastion sympathized and would do what it could to maintain supply lines, if only to preserve the fragile peace. After a short break to refuel and perform minor mechanical checks, Desert Wing steamed out of Seraph's Valley the following morning. The next leg of the journey stretched across a dusty, mine-laced plain leading to Glass Ridge, a settlement known for its glass-blowing artisans and rumored riches from an ancient vault. Its greatest resource was actually the skill to craft glass for greenhouses and drinking vessels. Luxuries in this harsh world. The route was rumored to be haunted by raiders using stolen pre-war tech, so Amani pressed their armed guard for heightened vigilance. Sharp-eyed watchers perched on the train's top, scanning for anything that might be lying in wait behind dunes or rocky outcroppings. An hour out from the valley, the train jerked abruptly. A shudder ran through its cars and a grinding noise echoed along the tracks. Before Amani could respond, a fierce explosion erupted behind them. She glanced at Roderick, who was already reaching for the radio to call the rear car. The second car responded with shouts. "Mining charge, the rails behind us just blew." Heart pounding, Amani realized their path back to Seraph's Valley was destroyed. Desert Wing had narrowly avoided that trap. Were it not for her decision to leave early that morning, the entire train could have been obliterated. Peering through the side mirror, she glimpsed a billow of smoke and debris rising in the distance. She counted her luck that they had passed the explosive device seconds before it detonated. But the next instant, muzzle flashes flared on the horizon, gun-wielding figures emerging from hidden trench lines. Bullets pinged off the locomotive's hull. The armed guards on the train returned fire in short bursts. The dryness of the desert carried the sound of the firefight for miles. Desert Wing's powerful engine roared, as if in defiance of the ambush, and Amani clenched her teeth, pushing the throttle to eke out every bit of speed remaining in the tired machinery. If they slowed, the raiders could swarm the train and strip it bare. A pitched battle erupted as the train lurched forward. The guards on the cargo cars took careful aim, each shot precious because ammunition was scarce and expensive to replace. Through the swirling dust clouds, Amani noticed scrawny shapes vaulting onto battered motorcycles, all of them converging on the train with suicidal determination. One rider tossed a homemade explosive, which clipped the last car, sending tremors rattling along the couplers. Miraculously, the blast failed to derail the car. Roderick barked into the radio, directing the guards on how to concentrate their fire. Amid the chaos, Amani struggled to maintain control. Bits of shrapnel clanged against the locomotive's boiler plating. She prayed that none of it would puncture the fuel lines. The onslaught continued for a punishing half hour, with the train forcing its way across rock piles and drifting sands, until, at last, the raiders vanished behind a distant rise. Either they had grown exhausted of attrition or Desert Wing had escaped the kill zone. When the final shot rang out, the stinging wind and rumble of wheels were the only sounds left. Amani slowed the locomotive to assess the damage. They had lost 2 cargo containers to sabotage, and a portion of the side plating was torn up. One guard was badly injured, bleeding from a chunk of shrapnel lodged in his side. The rest bore minor cuts and bruises. Even so, they pressed on. Giving up now would strand them in the middle of nowhere, with no immediate backup or resources. The day wore on, unrelenting in its heat. When dusk fell, the cargo train coasted gently around a bend, revealing the jagged outline of Glass Ridge that shimmered against the sunset like a hallucination. Spiraling towers constructed of molten glass, twisted in the twilight, flickering with brilliance. Amani had seen many city-states, but the artistry of Glass Ridge never ceased to amaze her. It was a testament to human creativity in a world that had done its best to stomp out hope. At the gates, local sentries bristled with suspicion, though these were quickly relieved by the city's watch captain who recognized the Bastion insignia. They ushered Desert Wing into a walled yard lined with thick panes of protective glass, engineered to shield vulnerable areas from storms and stray gunfire. Mechanics in soot-stained overalls immediately converged on the train, crawling under its cars to check for structural weakness. Amani hopped off the locomotive, her knees still quivering from the earlier ambush. As she approached one of the mechanics to coordinate repairs, a city official hurried over, a man in finely crafted glass-beaded robes. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes bloodshot. He introduced himself as Kaveh and insisted that he had urgent news affecting all outposts trading along these routes. A large-scale militia was rallying beyond the dunes, and they were systematically cutting off supply lines. Kaveh explained that this militia, formed from embittered survivors of the old armies, wanted control over all the region's remaining resources. They had begun a campaign to destroy vital rail lines, capturing or killing those trains that refused to submit. Their goal, so rumor stated, was to build a new empire and rewrite the rules of the wasteland. Amani felt a wave of nausea. If they succeeded, all the city-states would be starved into submission. Bastion, Seraph's Valley, Glass Ridge, they would fall one by one. Even Chrome Falls with its advanced salvage wouldn't stand a chance alone. That night, as the mechanics welded steel plates where the Desert Wing siding had been ripped open, Amani, Roderick, and Kaveh convened with worried locals in a large glasswork hall. Mats were spread on the floor, and a single lamp illuminated the distressed faces of people who recognized the severity of the threat. The militia would not stop until the city-states were forced to unite or be crushed. But unity was not so easily achieved in the desert. Distrust was rampant. Each outpost hoarded its food and water. Old feuds lingered from the war. Yet now, with a powerful enemy looming, a shared conversation began to form. Kaveh believed that if the city-states coordinated their forces, a small but united alliance, perhaps they could defend the lines that still connected them to each other. Amani and Roderick agreed that forging a coalition would be the only chance. Their train might be the link that brought a fractured people together. The plan, however, required that they continue to Chrome Falls. That outpost supposedly sat on an extensive stockpile of abandoned war machinery that might be repaired or repurposed for defense. But the route from Glass Ridge to Chrome Falls was the most perilous stretch remaining. No one had traveled it recently. It crossed the Spine of Ash, a place rumored to be crawling with mutated wildlife and bristling with radioactive hotspots. The rails were half buried, infested with sabotage left by roving marauders. But if Desert Wing could deliver ambassadors and gather Chrome Falls resources, it might change the tide. Such a journey could also rally hope in the hearts of people who believed the city-states might survive through cooperation. Come dawn, the Desert Wing was patched sufficiently to follow through with the plan. The mechanics of Glass Ridge had donated some precious biodiesel, not enough for the entire trip, but hopefully enough to reach Chrome Falls if they encountered no further sabotage. A dozen volunteers, including Kaveh, joined the expedition to represent the city. Amani had been awake all night, pacing among the cargo cars, making sure each coupler was secure. She felt the magnitude of what they were attempting, but also a stirring in her chest, a glimmer of idealism that had lain dormant. Perhaps the rails did more than carry supplies. Maybe they could bring people together. They ventured out, the train's horn echoing against the glass ramparts of the city behind them. For 2 days they traversed a desert marked by radioactive storms and swirling grit. Even the marauders seemed to avoid this place. Chunks of old artillery half buried in sand threatened the underside of the train. A crack in a steam valve forced Mani and Roderick to make emergency repairs using epoxy and salvaged tubing. Each setback drained their limited supplies. Nighttime offered its own hazards, as mutated scorpions the size of dogs skittered across the tracks, drawn by the vibrations. On the third morning, they reached the foothills of the Spine of Ash. From a distance, its jagged peaks looked as if a colossal beast had raked the earth. Dark clouds hovered overhead, swirling with toxic dust that radiated a dull green glow at twilight. Yet they forged on, assisted by route maps scribbled on time-worn parchment from Glass Ridge's archives. They advanced slowly, halting whenever the radiation counters in the locomotive's cabin spiked. The twisted remains of an old city sprawled in the valley below them, rusted highways, toppled skyscrapers, half consumed by shifting sands. They skirted the edges, searching for the track that led to Chrome Falls. Early on the fourth day, a glint on the horizon signaled success. The track, partially uncovered by the swirling wind, emerged from the dunes. Desert Wing followed it through steep inclines, the engine straining, until at last they glimpsed a settlement in the distance. Chrome Falls was not an elegant city-state. It was a cluster of metal plating and scaffolding perched on an elevated ridge, built around what appeared to be a massive pre-war factory. Great chimneys jutted from the ridge, their surfaces polished to a dull gleam, giving the city its name. Roderick's binoculars revealed heavy fortifications, mounted turrets, barbed wire, and barricades. The defenders were prepared for war. Once the city spotted the train, a small contingent of armed scouts arrived on motorized sleds, brandishing rifles. After tense negotiations on the radio, the scouts permitted them entry. Passing through a towering scrap metal gate, the Desert Wing chugged onto a wide platform that had been converted into something resembling a train station. A stony-eyed overseer named Colonel Ura met them in a cavernous hangar. Her squad wore mismatched uniforms cobbled from old fatigues with newly painted insignias. Ura listened gravely as Amani explained the threat posed by the gathering militia. Kava described how Glass Ridge, Bastion, and Seraph's Valley stood on fragile ground. He pleaded that Chrome Falls join forces with them, lending their resources to protect the rails and maintain the supply lines. By the end, Colonel Ura folded her arms, considering. "We've seen the militia's scouts prowling," she admitted. "They've tried to cut deals with us to share technology, but we refused. We're not interested in conquest or subjugation." Her eyes swept over the battered locomotive. "If we don't unite, we'll be crushed eventually." Within the hour, she escorted them to a row of carefully preserved vehicles in the factory's depths. Half a dozen troop transports, an old tank, a pair of battered artillery cannons. Most were missing parts. Ura explained that her engineers had been gradually restoring these relics of war, in case they needed to defend Chrome Falls. Though not fully operational, they could be made battle-ready if given the right components and technical expertise from the other cities. The realization struck Mani. If an alliance of city-states pooled their talents, they could repair this equipment, reinforce the trains, and mount a proper defense of the rails. They would not win a large-scale war, but they could protect their communities from immediate destruction, and maybe that was enough to keep hope alive. Negotiations stretched into the evening, culminating in an agreement for mutual aid. The next challenge was how to get the necessary parts and skilled technicians from the other outposts without losing more trains or shipments to the marauding militia. Roderick suggested forming small convoys with armed escorts. Kaveh proposed merging the city-state's best engineers into a mobile workshop. Ideas flowed, fueled by the collective determination that tragedies of the past would not be repeated. Shadows of the old war loomed large, but in that hangar, among battered machinery and flickering lanterns, an ember of unity began to glow. After ensuring minor repairs to the train, Amani prepared for the return journey. They would deliver the promise of Chrome Falls collaboration to the other outposts and spark the beginnings of a formal alliance. Word would spread that for the first time since the war, rival city-states were joining in common purpose. Emily felt a cautious optimism. She longed to see how Bastion might respond, how Saris Valley might channel its desire for stability, and how Glass Ridge's artisans could contribute to forging a protective shield around the rails. Perhaps in time, these battered rails could become something more than just a route for goods. They might become a foundation for peace. On their departure day, Colonel Ura's forces cleared the tracks of debris. As Desert Wing rolled out of Chrome Falls, escorted by a few lightly armored sleds for a short distance, Amani gazed back at the fortress city. She remembered her parents, the warnings they had given her about how petty rivalries and lust for power had destroyed the old world. Now, as she stared at the black horizon, she chose to believe that change was possible. The tracks might be scarred, the cargo battered, and the people suspicious, but the very act of traveling, connecting one scarred outpost to another, carried a spark of new beginnings. So they began the slow, arduous trek back across the spine of ash, carrying not just cargo but the seeds of an alliance. Where once the rails had served as a lifeline for scattered survivors, they might now serve as the conduit of hope, forging unity among those who had once feared and forsaken each other. Desert Wing creaked and groaned, the engine protesting the steep climbs, yet it held together, as if inspired by the same flame that now burned in Amani's chest. Each day brought challenges, sandstorms, mechanical hiccups, even a small group of raiders who quickly withdrew upon realizing the train was carrying more defenders than it had before. Roderick muttered, "That word must be traveling fast." A well-defended train was no easy target. The crucial test would come once they reached the other city-states, persuading them all to cooperate. A universal alliance had never been attempted, but in everyone's hearts, a flicker of yearning suggested it might be the only salvation left. Desert Wing rattled on, connecting battered communities across the desert's scarred battlefields. Life in this world was precarious, and the memories of war were fresh. Yet each turn of the wheels hummed a message of unity. Days stretched onward, sunrise to sunset, and the path ahead remained perilous. But now, with the promise of solidarity, the last city-states would not remain alone, gasping for breath in the sweltering dust of a dying planet. Amid the charred wreckage of the old era, a new bond was forming, born on rusted tracks and sealed with determination. And so the train pressed quietly into the horizon, carrying the fragile yet unyielding hope that, together, humanity could rise once more from the ashes.